Do you know what happens when power is abused, when those who think they're untouchable finally face justice? A black woman walks into a courtroom, calm and composed. Across the room, two officers smirk, convinced they'll win. But what happens when the truth comes out? When a wrongfully arrested woman turns out to be one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. This is the story of arrogance, injustice, and a reckoning no one saw coming. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. The grand, imposing halls of Silverwood County Courthouse in Chicago, Illinois, had seen countless cases over the years, but today was different. There was a certain electricity in the air, a charged silence that seemed to hang over the courtroom like a storm waiting to break. At the center of it all was Monica Hayes, a poised black woman in her early 40s, her tailored navy blue suit crisp and elegant. She walked with unshaken confidence, her high cheekbones and sharp dark eyes scanning the room like she had done this 1,000 times before. If she felt any nerves, she didn't show it. If she was intimidated, no one could tell. And yet, there was something off about this entire trial. The way the officers at the prosecution's table exchanged smug glances, the quiet murmurs in the gallery, the restless shifting of a few jurors, it was as if everyone sensed that this wasn't just another open and shut case. Seated at the prosecution's table, Officers Ethan Coleman and Ryan Mitchell looked far too pleased with themselves. Ethan Coleman, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, had the air of a man who had gotten away with too much for too long. His smug grin twisted slightly as he glanced toward Monica, his arms crossed over his chest in a way that screamed dominance. Ryan Mitchell, younger and more brash, had a certain sharp-edged arrogance, his eyes practically daring anyone to challenge his authority. His fingers drummed against the table rhythmically, his foot tapping as though this entire trial was nothing more than a minor inconvenience before he could return to business as usual. They weren't worried. They expected to win. Their confidence was mirrored in Victoria Langley, the assistant district attorney, who stood at the prosecution table with meticulous posture and a calculating expression. Everything about her, from her neatly tailored gray suit to the way she shuffled her notes, radiated control. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and began the opening argument. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice measured, her tone practiced. "What we have here is a clear case of obstruction. The facts are straightforward. Officers Coleman and Mitchell were conducting a critical police investigation in a neighborhood known for high criminal activity when the defendant, Miss Monica Hayes, inserted herself into the situation." Langley turned slightly, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. She disregarded lawful police orders. She refused to stand down. She interfered with an operation that required focus and discretion, and in doing so, she put officers and civilians at risk. Coleman and Mitchell nodded slightly, their expressions smug, as if Langley was simply repeating the obvious. Monica, however, did not flinch. She sat at the defense table, hands folded in front of her, face an unreadable mask. Her attorney, Benjamin Carter, sat beside her, his weathered face unreadable as he listened intently. Langley continued, her words slicing through the stillness. "Now, I understand that some people in this city may feel distrust toward law enforcement, but I ask you, if we allow civilians to challenge officers in the middle of active investigations, what message does that send? The law must be respected. And today, this courtroom will hold Miss Hayes accountable for her reckless behavior." Langley returned to her seat, and the weight of her argument settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Coleman smirked. Too easy. Then Benjamin Carter stood up. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. But there was something unshakable in the way he moved, a quiet, steady authority that demanded attention. Benjamin had been practicing law for over 30 years, and he had seen far too many cases like this, cases where authority was abused, where the system protected its own at the expense of the truth. And this was textbook. He took a few steps toward the jury, his hands clasped in front of him, his voice calm but firm. The prosecution paints Miss Hayes as an obstructionist, someone who was actively interfering with a police investigation, he said. They want you to believe that she is some reckless citizen who refused to respect the law. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. But let's talk about what really happened. Benjamin turned slightly toward the jury, his voice steady. Miss Hayes didn't interfere with a police investigation, he said. She asked questions. She wanted to understand why armed officers had suddenly descended upon a neighborhood, why they were handling residents with aggression instead of clarity. She was exercising her constitutional right to question those in power, and for that she was arrested. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Coleman shifted in his seat. Mitchell clenched his jaw. Benjamin took a slow breath, then continued. My client is not on trial today for committing a crime. She is on trial because she dared to ask questions, because she challenged a broken system, because two officers sitting right over there, he gestured to Coleman and Mitchell, didn't like being questioned. Langley's eyes narrowed, her fingers curling slightly against her notes. And here's what's important, Benjamin continued, his voice growing just a little sharper. We're not asking you to take our word for it. We have evidence, and we're going to show you something that the prosecution would rather you not see. Benjamin turned toward the judge. Your Honor, he said, his voice firm. The defense would like to introduce surveillance footage from the day of Miss Hayes's arrest. A heavy silence slammed down over the courtroom. Langley's jaw tensed, Coleman and Mitchell stiffened, and Monica allowed herself a single, slow breath, her gaze locked on the two officers across the courtroom. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Judge Ruth Calloway, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor, peered over her glasses at the defense table. Is the prosecution aware of this footage? She asked. Langley hesitated. Your Honor, while there is footage, we do not believe it is relevant to the specific charge at hand. I'll be the judge of that, Calloway interrupted, her tone clipped. She turned to Benjamin. Proceed. The courtroom hushed. The anticipation was palpable. A bailiff moved toward the evidence screen, preparing to play the video. Monica remained still, her hands resting lightly on the defense table. She knew what was coming. She knew what the footage would show. And as she stole a brief glance toward Ethan Coleman and Ryan Mitchell, she saw it, the first flickers of uncertainty in their eyes. For the first time, the two officers weren't looking so smug anymore. And that was only the beginning. The air inside Silverwood County Courthouse was thick with tension. The moment had come. All eyes were on the large screen as the surveillance footage began to play. The grainy black and white video flickered to life, capturing a quiet residential street in a Chicago neighborhood. The jury leaned in slightly, watching the ordinary scene unfold, a group of officers, a few police cars lining the curb, and a woman standing on the sidewalk. That woman was Monica Hayes. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't even in the officer's way. She was calmly talking, her hands moving in small, controlled gestures. She was asking a question. Yet within seconds, Officer Ryan Mitchell lunged at her. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Mitchell grabbed Monica's arm, yanking it behind her back. She stumbled, trying to keep her footing. Officer Ethan Coleman stepped in, crowding her space, his body language menacing. Monica didn't fight back. She barely even had time to react before she was forced face first against the hood of a police cruiser, her arms twisted behind her. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of the video continuing to play. Coleman leaned down, his mouth close to Monica's ear, whispering something the camera couldn't pick up. Mitchell pulled out a pair of handcuffs, locking them around her wrists with unnecessary force. Then, with barely a second glance at the woman they'd just manhandled, they shoved her into the back seat of their patrol car like she was nothing more than a piece of trash. The video cut off. For a moment, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Benjamin Carter turned toward the jury, letting the weight of what they had just seen sink in. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "where in that video do you see my client resisting arrest?" He let the question hang. The jurors looked uncomfortable. A few of them shifted in their seats, casting quick glances at each other. Monica sat stone still, her face unreadable. But if anyone looked closely, they'd see it. The tightness in her jaw, the way her hands curled into a fist beneath the table. Coleman and Mitchell. For the first time since this trial began, they weren't smirking anymore. Mitchell's eyes flicked toward Langley, the prosecutor. Coleman crossed his arms, trying to act unbothered, but the redness in his face gave him away. Langley cleared her throat, pushing herself up from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, voice sharp, "the prosecution maintains that this video does not tell the full story. The footage lacks audio. We don't know what words were exchanged, what threats may have been made." Benjamin turned toward her, raising an eyebrow. "Threats," he repeated. "Tell me, Miss Langley, does my client look like a threat in that video?" Langley didn't respond. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and turned toward the jury. "We can't rely on silent footage alone," she continued, "which is why we need to examine this incident in full context. And for that, we will hear testimony from trained law enforcement professionals." It was a clever move, redirecting the focus, trying to control the narrative again. But Benjamin wasn't about to let them bury the truth so easily. He turned to Judge Calloway. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call its first witness to the stand, Clara Robinson." Clara Robinson was a woman who had seen the world change more times than she could count. At 72, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime in education, shaping young minds. She walked to the stand with purpose, her silver hair pulled neatly into a bun. Her hands, weathered but strong, gripped the wooden railing as she was sworn in. Benjamin stepped forward. "Mrs. Robinson," he said kindly, "can you please state your connection to the events in question?" Clara nodded. "I live 3 houses down from where the incident occurred. I was walking my dog that afternoon when I saw the officers questioning a young woman outside her home. That's when Miss Hayes arrived." Benjamin nodded. "What did you see happen next?" Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She approached them, calmly. "I remember thinking how polite she was. She wasn't shouting, wasn't interfering, she just asked them a question." "And how did the officers react?" Clara's eyes hardened. "They dismissed her, treated her like she wasn't worth their time, but when she kept asking, when she wouldn't just walk away, that's when they grabbed her." A few jurors visibly tensed. Benjamin took a slow breath. "Did you hear what they said to her?" Clara hesitated. Then her fingers curled against the railing, her voice quieter now. "Yes," she said. "They called her one of those people, said she should mind her own damn business. One of them, Mitchell, I believe, muttered something about how people like her always cause trouble." Monica stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Benjamin nodded. "Just to be clear, Mrs. Robinson, are you saying that the officers used racially charged language?" Clara inhaled sharply. "Yes. That's exactly what I'm saying." The prosecution tried to discredit Clara. Langley attempted to paint her as an elderly woman with failing eyesight, a biased observer, but Clara did not waver. And that's when Benjamin played his next card. The defense calls Officer Michael Alvarez to the stand. A ripple of whispers swept through the courtroom. Michael Alvarez was still an active police officer, a cop testifying against other cops. That was rare and dangerous. Alvarez took the stand, his uniform crisp, his posture stiff. He was younger than Coleman but older than Mitchell, and his face was tight with tension. "Officer Alvarez," Benjamin began, "were you present at the station the night Miss Hayes was booked?" "Yes." "Did you review any footage from the officer's body cameras?" Alvarez hesitated. Then, finally, he exhaled. "There was no footage," he admitted. "Both of their body cameras malfunctioned." Benjamin's face was unreadable. "Both," Alvarez nodded stiffly. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Benjamin took a step closer. "Tell me, Officer Alvarez, how often do body cameras malfunction at the exact same time?" Alvarez swallowed. "It's rare." "How rare?" Alvarez's jaw tensed. Then, with visible reluctance, he said, "In my 8 years on the force, I've seen it happen maybe once, but never twice in the same case." Silence. Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mitchell's hand curled into a fist on the table. The jury was watching them now. And for the first time since this trial began, the officers seemed nervous. The cracks were starting to show. And Monica Hayes. She sat still, watching as the walls around them began to crumble. The courtroom was already buzzing with tension, but as the next witness was called, the energy shifted into something more intense, more electric. "Your Honor," Benjamin Carter said, his voice calm but firm. "The defense calls Monica Hayes to the stand." There was a brief pause, followed by a sudden hush that swept through the room. All eyes turned to Monica. She moved with measured grace, standing from her seat and walking toward the witness stand without hesitation. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't uncertain. If anything, she looked like she belonged there, as if she had done this 100 times before. She stepped up, raised her right hand, and took the oath. Then she sat down, folding her hands neatly in front of her. The courtroom held its breath. Benjamin Carter took his time. He knew the weight of this moment. He knew that one wrong step could shift the tide, but he also knew that he had the prosecution exactly where he wanted them. He approached the witness stand deliberately, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice steady, "please tell the court a little about yourself. What do you do for a living?" There was no hesitation in her response. "I am currently the director of the National Security Agency." Silence. Not the awkward, brief silence that sometimes follows unexpected statements. No. This was a deep, gut-punch silence. The kind of silence that drained the air from the room. The kind of silence that made every single person in the courtroom freeze, as if their minds were struggling to process what they had just heard. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, a sharp inhale from someone in the jury box. A muffled curse from the back of the room. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The shock hit like a tsunami. Ethan Coleman and Ryan Mitchell froze, their once smug expressions shattering into something that could only be described as raw panic. Coleman's jaw dropped slightly, his eyes darting toward Monica as if he had just seen a ghost. Mitchell's fingers tightened into fists, his breath coming out in short, rapid bursts. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a crumbling cliff's edge with no way out. Victoria Langley, the assistant district attorney, sat completely still, her face a perfect mask of control. But even she couldn't hide the way her hands clenched slightly against her notes. She knew. She knew that the trial had just turned upside down. Benjamin let the silence stretch for a few more seconds, allowing the weight of Monica's words to sink in. Then, casually, he turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cool and measured, "I want you to take a moment to fully understand what just happened here." He gestured toward Monica. "My client, The woman these officers brutalized, humiliated, and arrested under false pretenses is not just some random civilian. He turned toward the stunned officers. These men forcibly detained, threatened, and lied about the director of the National Security Agency. The weight of that statement slammed into the courtroom like a wrecking ball. One of the jurors audibly exhaled, shaking their head in disbelief. Another had their arms crossed so tightly, it looked like they were holding themselves together. The reporters in the gallery exploded into frantic movement, whispering to one another, grabbing their phones, texting their newsrooms, already preparing breaking news alerts. The case was no longer just about Monica Hayes vs. two officers. This was a national scandal. Coleman was the first to break. He leaned toward Mitchell, whispering something harsh, fast, panicked. Mitchell shook his head sharply, his face a mix of anger and sheer terror. They both looked at Langley, their supposed shield, but the Ada wasn't even looking at them anymore. She was staring straight at Monica. And for the first time since the trial began, Victoria Langley looked afraid. Langley shot up from her seat, desperation creeping into her voice. "Your Honor, I object." Judge Calloway raised a single hand, not in warning, not in anger, but in a gesture that carried absolute authority. "Objection denied," she said coolly. "Miss Langley, sit down." Langley's lips pressed into a thin line, but she obeyed. She knew she had lost control, and now it was survival mode. Benjamin turned back to Monica. "Miss Hayes," he said, "on the day of your arrest, did you in any way obstruct a police investigation?" "No." "Did you resist arrest?" "No." "What were you doing?" Monica's eyes locked onto the jury, her voice as clear as glass breaking in the quiet. "I was asking questions," she said. "I was making sure that the officers, who are sworn to serve and protect, were acting within the law." "And for that you were thrown into a police car?" "Yes," Benjamin nodded. Then he turned back toward the jury. "This case isn't just about what happened to Miss Hayes," he said. "This is about who is held accountable and who isn't." He let that sit for a moment. Then, calmly, he returned to his seat. Within minutes of the revelation, social media erupted. Breaking: 2 Chicago officers falsely arrested the director of the NSA. Federal official illegally detained. Chicago PD under fire. Cover-up exposed in real time. What happens now? News vans surrounded the courthouse within the hour. Protesters began gathering outside, holding signs that read "Justice for Monica Hayes" and "Accountability Now." Inside the courtroom, Langley knew she had to act fast. She turned toward the officers, her voice low and sharp. "You need to start talking," she hissed. "Because right now, you're both looking at a very long prison sentence." Coleman swallowed hard, his face paler than ever. Mitchell just stared ahead, his jaw tight, his whole body coiled like a man about to break. They had walked into this courtroom believing themselves untouchable. Now, they were trapped in a firestorm of their own making. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. After days of testimony, shocking revelations, and the unraveling of a deeply flawed system, the moment had come. Everyone was waiting. Judge Ruth Calloway sat high above the courtroom, her gavel resting lightly in her hand. The jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a tight grip on the verdict slip, rose slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room. Her eyes landed for a brief second on Monica Hayes, then moved to the 2 men whose futures were about to be decided. Ethan Coleman and Ryan Mitchell sat at the defense table, their once bold confidence completely shattered. Gone were the smirks. Gone was the arrogance. What remained were 2 men grasping at the last straws of their authority, knowing that in just a few moments they could lose everything. The bailiff took the slip, walking it to Judge Calloway. She unfolded it slowly, scanning the contents. Not a single sound echoed in the room. Then she nodded. She handed the slip back to the foreperson, who cleared her throat and spoke the words that would change everything. On the charge of false arrest, we find the defendants guilty. A murmur rippled through the room. On the charge of perjury, we find the defendants guilty. And just like that, it was over. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Then, a sharp gasp from the back of the room. A muffled cheer from someone in the gallery. Coleman sucked in a breath, his entire face drained of color. Mitchell's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like he might shatter his own teeth. Langley, the assistant district attorney, barely moved. But if anyone looked closely, they would have seen her fingers tightening around the edge of the prosecution's table, as if she knew her entire case had just crumbled beneath her. Judge Calloway turned toward the two disgraced officers. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Ethan Coleman, Ryan Mitchell, the jury has found you guilty of false arrest and perjury. As of this moment, you are hereby stripped of your badges and placed on indefinite suspension pending further federal investigation." Coleman opened his mouth as if to protest, but before he could sputter out even a single word, Calloway continued. "In addition," she said firmly, "due to the nature of this case and the implications regarding civil rights violations, a full-scale federal investigation will be conducted into your actions, as well as the patterns of behavior within the Chicago Police Department." Boom! The final blow. Mitchell sagged in his chair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Coleman gritted his teeth, gripping the table as if he could somehow stop the inevitable from happening. They thought they had absolute power. Now they had nothing. The moment Judge Calloway slammed her gavel down, the courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones, typing furiously as they updated their headlines. Breaking: Officers Coleman and Mitchell found guilty, federal investigation launched. Cameras flashed, capturing every stunned reaction, every moment of history being made. And then, from outside the courthouse, the roar of a growing crowd could be heard. By the time Monica Hayes walked out of the courthouse, the streets of Chicago were alive with protest. Hundreds, no, thousands, of people had gathered, their voices rising in unison, demanding justice not just for Monica but for every black man and woman who had been silenced, mistreated, and brutalized by a corrupt system. Justice for all. Accountability now. No badge above the law. Signs waved high in the air, voices chanting loud enough to shake the ground beneath them. Monica stood at the top of the courthouse steps, gazing out at the sea of faces. For the first time in a long time, people believed change was possible. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The verdict was a victory, but the fight was far from over. As expected, the fallout was immediate. Within hours, the Chicago Police Department was under federal investigation. High-ranking officials resigned, knowing they would either be forced out or publicly humiliated. Old complaints against Coleman and Mitchell resurfaced, revealing a long history of misconduct that had been swept under the rug. The mayor of Chicago, under enormous pressure, called an emergency press conference. Standing before a sea of reporters, Mayor Daniel Faulkner did something no Chicago mayor had ever done before. He acknowledged the problem. "The events of this trial," he began, his voice carefully measured, "have exposed deep flaws in our justice system, flaws we can no longer ignore." The cameras zoomed in on his face as he spoke the words the public had been waiting to hear for years. "As of today, I am implementing new policies to address police misconduct, including external oversight of police investigations and mandatory disciplinary actions for officers found guilty of excessive force." It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Coleman and Mitchell weren't just dealing with job loss. They were dealing with something far worse. Their faces were everywhere, on the news, on social media, on the front page of every major newspaper. They couldn't walk down the street without being recognized, and when they did, it wasn't met with respect. It was met with rage. Their families faced public scrutiny, their friends distanced themselves, and the police union, once their biggest shield, refused to defend them. Their downfall had been swift, brutal, and inescapable. And Monica? She watched it all unfold with quiet resolve. As Monica sat in her office that night, overlooking the glowing city of Chicago, she let herself take one small, quiet breath. This wasn't just a victory for her. This was a turning point for an entire city, an entire system, an entire nation. She wasn't naive. She knew that the road ahead would be long, that real change would take more than just one trial, one case, one moment. But today was proof that justice wasn't impossible, that even the untouchable could fall. That no badge, no uniform, no institution was above accountability. And for the first time in a long, long time, Chicago had hope. The aftermath of the Coleman and Mitchell trial had sent shockwaves across the nation. News outlets continued dissecting every detail, social media was on fire, and the streets of Chicago were still buzzing with the energy of protest and change. But for Monica Hayes, the fight was far from over. In the days following the verdict, she found herself at the center of something much larger than a single courtroom victory. She had become a symbol, not just of justice, but of accountability, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of the truth. The city needed change, and Monica, she was going to make sure it happened. Sitting in her office at the National Security Agency, Monica scanned the latest reports flooding her inbox. Since the trial, she had been working non-stop, using every resource at her disposal to push for deeper systemic reform. Her role at the NSA gave her access to intelligence, but more importantly, it gave her power. Power to expose corruption, misconduct, and abuse of authority, not just in Chicago but across the entire country. And she wasn't going to waste it. She implemented new oversight policies, ensuring that local police departments, especially those with a history of misconduct, were subject to federal review. She pushed for stricter laws on body camera usage, making it nearly impossible for officers to simply claim malfunction when evidence went missing. She worked with lawmakers, civil rights leaders, and advocacy groups to introduce a national database tracking officers with excessive complaints, ensuring that bad cops could no longer jump from department to department without consequence. And most importantly, she made sure the fight against corruption was no longer one-sided. For too long, ordinary citizens had been at the mercy of a broken system. Now, the system itself was being forced to answer for its failures. But Monica wasn't done yet. She had been wrongfully arrested. She had been humiliated, targeted, and dragged through a trial that never should have happened. And for that, the city of Chicago was going to pay, not for her, but for the people who had suffered long before her name made headlines. With Benjamin Carter leading the legal effort, Monica filed a lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department and the city itself. Her demands: a multi-million-dollar settlement, not for personal gain, but to establish a permanent fund dedicated to helping victims of police brutality and systemic misconduct. Every penny would go toward legal aid services for those fighting wrongful charges, educational programs that taught communities about their rights, support networks for families affected by police violence. Chicago had ignored its people for too long. Now, it was time for the city to pay back what it owed. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the political structure of Chicago. City officials scrambled, trying to contain the damage, but there was no clean way out. The public was watching, and they weren't going to accept excuses. Under relentless pressure, the mayor's office agreed to settle, awarding a historic payout that would forever change the way Chicago handled cases of police misconduct. The city also announced a complete restructuring of its civilian oversight board, ensuring that officers like Coleman and Mitchell could never rise to power again. For the first time in decades, it felt like real, tangible change was happening. And Monica, she had forced them to do it. One evening, long after the courtroom battles had ended, Monica returned to the neighborhood where everything had started. The streets that had once been filled with fear and tension now felt lighter. Children played outside without hesitation, their laughter echoing down the blocks, a sound that had once been rare in these parts. She walked slowly, taking in the small but undeniable changes, the way neighbors spoke with renewed confidence, the way officers patrolling the area now moved with more restraint, knowing that their every action would be held accountable. And then she saw it. A new mural, freshly painted on the side of a once dilapidated alley wall. The colors were bold, vibrant. The imagery was powerful, a vision of unity, of resilience, of hope. And in large, striking letters, the message read, "Justice has no color. The truth will always prevail." Monica stared at it for a long moment, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were finally getting somewhere. But she knew better than anyone. This wasn't the end of the fight. It never would be. Not until every system that had failed its people was rebuilt from the ground up. Not until every corrupt officer, every unjust policy, every abuse of power was torn down and replaced with something better. Not until justice was no longer a privilege but a guarantee. She let out a slow breath, her gaze lingering on the mural. Then she turned and walked away, the city lights of Chicago glowing in the distance. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for today she could stand tall knowing that change was finally beginning.